Welcome to this year in review. This is going to be a little year in review from me, from Philosophy Portal, and just sort of summarizing everything that's happened in 2023 as a type of retrospective, because I feel like a lot of the time, ever since I started Philosophy Portal, that actually a lot of the things that go on behind the scenes don't get enough attention. And there really is a lot going on behind the scenes, but there has been a lot going on just on the YouTube channel, on the Substack, sort of things that are just openly available online. And I thought it would be really interesting to sort of summarize. There have been so many conversations, so many projects, and just sort of to get maybe a higher order perspective on everything that's taken place and sort of the meaning of the drive that's been repeating in this second year of Philosophy Portal. For those who don't know, yes, I started Philosophy Portal 2 years ago. It's mostly focused on delivering online courses, and those can be found at philosophyportal.online. There's also other sort of dimensions of Philosophy Portal, and I think that in this video, I'll try and give a sense of everything that's sort of been experimented with. Since you're watching this on YouTube, the most obvious dimension of Philosophy Portal would be the philosophical conversation series. I've had a tremendous opportunity to speak with so many amazing people this year. Actually looking back on it and just going over my notes and some of the conversations that I've had this year, I'm kind of overwhelmed by how many great people and interesting minds I've had a chance to speak with. And I just sort of made a very short list of some of the conversations that I think hit the most, resonated the deepest, and sort of made a summary of, you know, what I think those conversations point towards and what that might mean for like the future focus of Philosophy Portal and sort of, mining the sort of collective intelligence, the cumulative discourse that has emerged from these conversation series. I mean, some of the videos that at least ranked the highest, and I'll link them in the description, and maybe they'll put some images around me, is the conversations around psychoanalysis and AI with Isabel Millar, conversations about negativity in psychoanalysis with Julie Reich, the Orthodox Heretic with Peter Rollins, the Racist Fantasy with Todd McGowan, Embracing the Void with Richard Boothby, the New German Idealism with Adrian Johnston, Nick Land with the Theory Underground guys and Michael Downs and David McCarricker, Death of the Millennial Left with Chris Catrone, Reading Lacan's Decree with Samuel McCormick, and For They Know Not What They Do, also with the Theory Underground guys. And there's so many more. There's really too many to name. However, when I was going over some of these conversations and reflecting on them, I mean, I think that there's three main dimensions that stick out to me as orienting the work of Philosophy Portal and maybe some of the conversations and directions that we can pursue moving forward. The first is, I think, psychoanalysis outside of the clinic. I think this came up over and over again, is how rich psychoanalysis is as a field, how many people are intrigued by it, interested in it, writing books about it, writing dissertations about it, but not just in a way that confines psychoanalysis to clinical work, really trying to find ways, trying to find new connection points, entry points between psychoanalysis and the rest of culture, the rest of society, the relationship between psychoanalysis and technology. Of course, thinking here about Isabel Millar's artificial intelligence, psychoanalysis and culture, psychoanalysis and religion, the way in which psychoanalysis can play some role in a theory of religion, or really going to the core of what religion is about in some sense. Here, thinking about Richard Boothby and his concept of Das Ding and really going into the mystery of the other, psychoanalysis and society in general, the potential utility of thinking about psychoanalysis and politics. So I just really see this as a tremendously important bridge to both open up conversations about the connection between psychoanalysis and its work outside of the clinic, and just that general tendency, deepening it, extending it, seeing insofar as that leads us to new areas, new dimensions. I think the next big dimension is the dimension of theopolitics. And I think what I'm thinking here in general is the way in which, starting, I suppose, with my conversation with Chris Catrone on the death of millennial left, the way in which it's kind of glaringly obvious that secular politics has failed, that secular politics, left and right, perhaps even that matrix is no longer useful to think with, has in some sense collapsed, fallen apart. The fact that secular politics has failed so dramatically, I think many people are realizing that the deeper layer of politics is actually theology and the relationship between theology and politics. And yet the conversation is still so confused. The conversation is still so, let's say, in its infancy, and trying to push that forward. Also, the way in which, when we think about the future of technology, inclusive of artificial intelligence, that this brings us to imminent theological questions. Also thinking about, I think, the relationship between God and religion is another major talking point. And again, I think going to the heart and the core of the origin of religion. What is it that religions share, the religious drive, the religious impulse? What is common? Is there anything common there? And I think, how do we reinterpret theology? How do we reinterpret religion in a modern secular age is a huge area in need of future conversation. And then finally, the frontier of philosophical exploration. I think it would be unwise for me to suggest anything other than, it seems like, at least in the conversations I've been having, the frontier of philosophical exploration does have some relationship to analysis, the unconscious, also theology and politics, but the way in which philosophy and philosophical cognition is required to deepen these conversations about the relationship between thinking and analysis, as well as thinking and theopolitics, and as well as some major themes and thinkers related to technological singularity, whether that's Bostrom, Kurzweil, and of course, Nick Land, as I think came up in the conversation with the Theory Underground guys, Michael Downs and David McCarricker. Nick Land as the father of accelerationism, and that really we need to go back to both Land as sort of the origin of modern accelerationism, but also his major influences, Deleuze and Guattari, to sort of understand the deeper implications of sort of entering into an accelerationist philosophy, as well as, I think, of course, as is sort of standard for the channel, a sort of ongoing recognition of the importance of Slavoj Žižek as a fundamental thinker, bringing Slavoj Žižek into the center of philosophical discussion, not seeing Žižek as a peripheral figure or someone who is just a sort of pop icon or a larger cultural influence, but that someone who does not have something to say about fundamental philosophy. I think more and more people are realizing that Slavoj Žižek is absolutely central for not only contemporary philosophy, but the future of philosophy. And I think that's something that definitely needs to continue to be extended, both through philosophical conversations, like I'd point to the one I had with Adrian Johnston on a new German idealism, but also in many other ways, whether that's through coursework, whether that's through different styles of organizing live events around some of the central concepts that I think make Zizek's work so central to an emerging, vital online community. Now that handles the philosophical conversation side of things, but there's also a lot of other things that have been going on Philosophy Portal. And I suppose the best place to start would be with the online courses. This year, I've taught two major online courses. The Science of Logic, of course, one of Hegel's greatest works, if not his greatest work, as well as Lacan's Écrits, which we'll get to in time, which is Lacan's writings, as opposed to his seminar. I suppose starting with the logic, I think that at least what I take from the course and the conference, which is available on philosophyportal.online for free. We also have an anthology coming out which will be coming out in the first half of 2024. Just starting with the course, I mean, I think the most important thing as a sort of takeaway is why bother with either reading the logic or taking the course would be this huge transition from Aristotle to Hegel, which is in some sense necessitated by the modern scientific universe. In some ways, we could frame what Hegel's doing with the science of logic as saying, look, we have emerged into a new modern scientific universe, a new method has been developed, and this method has led to a certain form of progress, a certain form of transformation of our society on a fundamental level. We have a new science of physics, we have a new science of chemistry, we have a new science of biology, anthropology, and so forth, but we haven't yet applied science to logic, hence the title Science of Logic. And basically what Hegel's saying is, yes, you've got new scientific method, but you're still using Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic has remained unchanged. I mean, a lot is what is at stake here in bringing science to logic is thinking about the relationship between form and content, the way in which they're fundamentally connected, the way in which they fundamentally interconnect and affect one another. But another sort of mega important aspect of the science of logic is the relationship between universality on the one hand and singularity on the other hand. The relationship between universality and singularity, that is, the relationship between our notions of, let's say, a universal being and our notions of a singular self-concept, that the relationship between the development and the maturation of a singular self-concept has implications for how we understand universal being and vice versa. One could say that the logic of universality has to include within it the logic of a conceptual singularity, but also, I think, the way in which a conceptual singularity can birth new universality. And this loop between universality and singularity is something that caught my attention and also was the center of a lot of my thoughts on the science of logic in the Science of Logic conference. I think another really important aspect of Hegel's Science of Logic is just the foundation stone, the principle on which the logic turns. And Hegel himself says, if you don't understand this principle, don't even bother continuing with the logic itself. And that is the relationship, again, the weird unity between being and nothing. That usually we conceive of being and nothing as separate. Usually we consider being and nothing as having nothing to do with each other. But Hegel sees them as fundamentally connected and opening up the path to a true becoming. And I think that this project of the philosophical sciences, as he articulates it, is something that it doesn't seem like the last 200 years of philosophy has really understood, internalized, and worked with. And so really correcting that error is something that I see is an important next step for philosophy, and hopefully something that Philosophy Portal can play a role in contributing to in the larger culture. And I think that brings me to the only collective publication this year through Philosophy Portal, that is the second anthology, but the only anthology we published this year, for Abyssal Arrows. Abyssal Arrows is an anthology publication inspired by Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And the reason why that's so fundamentally connected to what I was talking about with Hegel's Science of Logic and the unity of being and nothing and the logic of becoming as so fundamental to the rest of philosophy, modern philosophy, is because at least when I was teaching Nietzsche's Zarathustra, I had my eye to rethinking the way in which we approach Nietzsche's Zarathustra and the way in which we perhaps see Nietzsche in general. We see Nietzsche as oftentimes anti or incompatible with Hegel, anti or incompatible with the project of German idealism. And I think that this is a tremendous mistake. I think that we've inherited this interpretation through a lot of great 20th century philosophers. However, I think, does a misservice or disservice to German idealism, and it doesn't really show actually the strange unity that it is itself at work between a figure like Hegel and a figure like Nietzsche. Specifically, I can get technical on some of these claims. Specifically, I was looking at in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the sort of becoming structure in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as fundamentally including within itself the relationship between being and nothing. This is sort of deep within Zarathustra's own discourse. When Zarathustra's speaking, when Zarathustra's teaching, when Zarathustra's in self-reflection, the unity of being and nothing is throughout. And not only that, but there's a higher order dialectical structure internal to the type of affirmation the yay saying, that we connect fundamentally to Nietzsche's philosophy. That is, when we look to the spiritual metamorphoses that go into the emergence of the spirit child, the camel, the lion, the child, we don't just see a sort of immediate affirmationalism. We do see the emergence of an affirmationalism, but that only comes out through, seems to me, to be the structure of the negation of the negation, a type of Hegelian logic, basically. The negation of the negation also basically speaking to and involving the relationship between the camel and the lion, that the negativity of the camel itself needs to be negated through the desire, passion, courage of the lion in order to get to a type of affirmationalism, a type of yay saying. And I think that if we do away with this sort of dialectical structure, if we do away with the unity of being a nothing which is involved in a true becoming, we potentially miss the deeper structure of Nietzsche's Zarathustra and the importance of bringing myth and fantasy into philosophy in the way that Nietzsche's Zarathustra, I think, does so well, especially in the context in which Nietzsche's sort of basically addressing his discourse, that is, addressing his discourse to the society involved in the murder and the killing of God, the death of God. And there's so much to go into there, so much more to explore there, specifically, I think, as it relates to psychoanalysis and, of course, Freud's emphasis on the unconscious and its relationship to killing, and specifically killing the father. And that leads me, I suppose, to really what I could call the second half of Philosophy Portal's year. First, I want to start with the smaller course that I did with David McCarricker of Theory Underground in collaboration with Theory Underground on what is sex. David McCarricker and I took on the project to teach what is sex. Many videos related to that project are publicly available online, including our discussion with Alenka Zupancic, who came into the course herself and had a private Q&A with some of the students, but also sort of our unpacking of both the introduction and the conclusion of what is sex. You know, really, I think what's key here, if I'm going to just summarize, you know, why bother with this book, why bother with this course at all, is, let's just say, sex negativity. And I want to frame that in relationship to sex positivity, that I think today, in a postmodern culture, in a permissive culture, we do have a explicit culture that focuses on sex positivity. That is, let's say, a culture which has an unproblematic notion and an unproblematic relation to sexuality. But I think this is precisely what Alenka Zupancic is fighting against in What is Sex, and saying, no, look, there's something strange, there's something negative, there's something contradictory about sex, which is even at the heart of our analytic or therapeutic culture, and even is being repressed by that analytic and therapeutic culture, paradoxically. Not so, in other words, not only is modern postmodern culture, permissive culture, engaging in a weird type of repression of sexuality, but this has spread back into therapy, back into analysis, where really the only place we have to dive into and investigate the negativity and the contradictions of sexuality is itself under threat, is itself under attack. And this leads to, or contributes to, an increasing disorientation in our identities if we're not really able to work with the negativity at the core of sex. And I think that ultimately this is not a nihilistic philosophy. It's, at the end of What is Sex, she's pointing towards, this requires us, this tarrying with the negative, let's say, it requires that we find new signifiers that work. One way to say this is to say that the way in which we symbolize our relationships, the way in which we articulate our boundaries and our agreements and our negotiations around sexuality, desire, and love are no longer working. And the paradox here is that we need to go into the negativity and the contradictions in order to find the signifiers that work. Does that involve a return or a unearthing or a revival of certain forms of religious signification and sexuality? Perhaps. Is there another way to interpret, or is there another form of signification that might work? And these are things, again, that are sort of experimental. These things are things that we need to precisely open up new dialogues around. And hopefully I'll be able to get to ways in which Philosophy Portal's trying to do that a little later in the video. But before going in that direction, I want to talk about the last course that Philosophy Portals delivered. That is the course on Lacan's Crete. It's a heavy psychoanalytic work, one of the most famous psychoanalytic works. Some people say the most innovative psychoanalytic work since Freud. Before going into the Crete course itself, though, we hosted the seminars for the Crete, where 4 different thinkers on the frontier, I think, of Lacanian psychoanalysis outside of the clinic, Isabel Millar, Richard Boothby, Peter Rollins, and Todd McGowan, each brought their own sort of perspective to Lacan's Crete and sort of demonstrated the way in which they are working with some of the core ideas in Lacan's Crete in their own way, just showing the richness of the field and just showing how many different directions are available, whether it's Isabel Millar talking about Padai politics, the politics of suffering and the body, also jouissance in the body. Peter Rollins talking about pyrotheology, and really rethinking liturgy, rethinking the church, rethinking religion fundamentally inclusive of psychoanalysis, whether it's Richard Boothby thinking about Das Ding and the other, thinking about Das Ding and the other, the mystery of the other as fundamental to the ground and the core of religious structure, that religions grow out of this mystery of the other, which we find so central in psychoanalytic thought. And then Todd McGowan talking about lack and desire, but also excess, and that connection between his seminar for the Acreon, specifically lack and desire, transitioning into the course to focus on excess, I think really gives us insight into not only the structure of desire, but the importance and the centrality of some excessive remainder, which cannot be reduced to any utility function, cannot be reduced to any sort of a calculation scheme, that we have to make room for this useless excess, that we have to make room for useless excess in order to really get to the core of understanding the structure of lack and desire. I think it's a fundamental contribution. Now going into the course itself, I mean, I have a very strange history with Lacan's Crete. It was something that I read and tarried with myself during my doctorate, and it was really a joy to teach it and gave me new insights. I think the only thing I want to share here is just some of the major things that came up for me while teaching that sort of just, were distinctions I was aware of, but distinctions that just sort of became clear for me, and distinctions that I think I'll keep working with in the future, as I think is so important to the future of philosophy. The first being, I think, the distinction which comes up throughout the entire Crete, which is the distinction between the ego and the subject of the unconscious. The ego on the imaginary level, we could say the subject of the unconscious on the real level, and the movement in the Crete from the imaginary to the symbolic, ultimately pointing towards the real, as involving this relationship between the ego and the subject of the unconscious, and the analytic process as really focusing on the split between the ego and the subject of the unconscious, and that this split fundamentally involves desire. And what's at stake in working this split is the possibility of drive, is the possibility of a new motivational structure, which I think, interestingly, something I learned in teaching the Acree is that it has something to do with both the guidance and the dissolution of demand, that the ego makes demand, that the ego demands satisfaction, that the ego demands the other, stemming from its own infancy, stemming ultimately from the impotent body, but that the dissolution of demand has something to do with the transition from desire in an imaginary ego sense to drive in a more symbolic, intersubjective, and even beyond intersubjective sense. And also that this involves an affirmation and acceptance of what Lacan, following Freud, will call castration, that there's a certain sacrifice involved in this transition, specifically at the level of what Lacan will call the imaginary phallus, towards the affirming of the, let's say, the symbolic phallus, and that this has something to do with being in relationship to a perfect ego ideal and transitioning towards a more symbolic intersubjectivity, which can accept lack, which can accept otherness, which can accept different. And again, what's at stake here in this transition, I think, has something fundamentally to do with our starting condition as impotent infants, that we universally start without the capacity to talk or walk or even move. Lacan will talk about poor motor coordination, and that reconciling ourselves with the impotent body in relationship to the ego ideal, which is basically an image of omnipotence, is really what's at stake, both in analysis and I think in terms of interpreting analysis philosophically. That basically summarizes the coursework, as well as talking about the anthology that was released through Philosophy Portal. But there's been something else I've been experimenting behind the scenes, which I'm sure most people don't know about, which is Real Talk. Real Talk is a, let's say it's a live event space. And this term, live event space, is really something that I want to develop further into 2024. But specifically experimenting with Real Talk is basically it's a combination of psychoanalysis and philosophy. It's using the methods of psychoanalysis, that of free association and full speech, and linking it up with inspiration from philosophical concepts and thinkers who are actively working with philosophical concepts in, let's say, the liminal web. And it's been a fantastic adventure to combine psychoanalysis and philosophy in a very practical sense. Again, in a live event space, in a way that really brings these concepts to life, I think, in a new way. And without giving away too much about what's been going on Real Talk, because everything there is private, more or less there only for the people who attend live. This is really something I want to keep experimenting with Philosophy Portal. I think the courses are fantastic. I think the conversations are fantastic, but I really think the live event space needs to be taken to the next level. And that's why I'm excited to launch in 2024 not only a membership package with Philosophy Portal, but also a focus with this membership package being a live event space and just developing new ways to bring discourse to life, to bring thinkers that I respect, admire, and want to work with in a more deeper sense into closer interconnection, into closer communion. And so this is something that I'm going to be working with in 2024. I'm going to do an entire video on what you might expect from Philosophy Portal in 2024. But this has sort of been a summary of everything that's happened in 2023. Again, so many rich conversations, so many great philosophical dialogue at the intersection of psychoanalysis, theopolitics, and the edge of philosophy itself. Two huge courses, the Science of Logic and the Acree, which are available on philosophyportal.online. A shorter course with Theory Underground, What is Sex, as well as the anthology Abyssal Arrows, which is also available, philosophyportal.online. I think just summarizing this year, I think going back to really understand what is logic scientifically going to be so important moving forward into the future. Understanding Lacan's Creed going to be so important for understanding the future of analysis outside the clinic, as well as, of course, the clinic. And then What is Sex being sort of a really contemporary philosophical piece, which is really, I think, speaking to our moment, that is in a sort of permissive, liberal, sex-positive culture, bringing back sexual negativity to the forefront and demanding sort of that we need to rethink the signifiers and the boundaries at work in, say, the theopolitics of sexuality. And so moving forward, I think that just gives you a sense of what Philosophy Portal has been up to and gives you a sense of what might be pointing and informing our future orientation moving into 2024. Thank you so much if you've been listening and watching this entire time. Again, my name's Cadell Last. You can find all of the work that's been going on at Philosophy Portal at philosophyportal.online. And if you've been involved with Philosophy Portal throughout 2022, 2023, thank you so much. Really, this work is not possible without the people who get involved, lend their time, are willing to engage in deep conversations, take the courses, really engage in deep coursework, show up for discussions, are writing, are researching, are thinking. I think it really changes the culture. It's super important for the culture. And I just hope that there's more and more of that energy coming in 2024. So lots of ways to get involved in 2024, and links to everything I've discussed here will be in the description. All right. Thanks for watching, and I'm out.